In this video, I'm also going to talk a lot about the Jewish historian Josephus. I've talked about him previously. I believe he was a Christian. I'm more confirmed to that now than I was in the past. And I'm surprised to discover that I'm not the only one who thinks that, or thought that. I'm convinced that whatever sources Mark used to talk about the fall of Jerusalem here, Josephus was using the same source. He also uses sources from the Gospel of Luke, used by the Gospel of Luke as well, as you'll see. I don't think he read Luke. I'm pretty sure he did not read the Gospel of John. In fact, I'd be surprised if he did. Maybe an early draft of it, but not later. But I'd also be surprised if he had not read Matthew and Mark, especially if he's a Christian. Matthew is the Jewish Gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Josephus all lived in Rome. And if you were in the Roman Church, you knew Matthew and Mark. And since I'm confident now that Mark was inspired to organize his Gospel along the lines of the Zodiac by the cult of Mithras, and the cult of Mithras was probably created by the Roman government to unify the personalities of Roman soldiers so that they learn how to face death well. And since Josephus had been adopted into the emperor's family, hence Flavius Josephus, there are too many important connections to ignore, especially since many important members of the Flavian imperial family converted to Christianity. So they had to hear about it from someone that they trusted, and Josephus seems like an obvious choice. This section will also be split off into a separate video because it's important and a separate thing in its own right. Okay, so let's begin our journey into the Bible. As for yourselves, beware, for they will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. And the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. This is one of the reasons why I think we're approaching the end. This is the age of the internet, at least, if not the age of Aquarius. There's nowhere to run from the gospel anymore. When they bring you to trial and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you at that time, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. There is Saturn and Uranus, and then Zeus and Saturn. You will be hated by all because of my name. We're going to talk about this, but let's finish. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. I even wonder about this, to be honest. So I finally started reading Flavius Josephus, and to do that, I bought an old copy, very old, of a translation from the 1700s by a man named William Whiston. Now, if you have a founding father who didn't read Greek and or couldn't get access to the original Greek of Josephus, this is a translation they would have read. It would have been considered the most up-to-date. And a lot of them could do both. Now, the life of Flavius Josephus, which is his biography, is among the last things that he ever wrote. And it confirms both my theories that the infancy narrative of the Gospel of Luke is a Jewish priestly source. It comes from the priests. And that Josephus was actually believed that Jesus was the Messiah, which he said he did in the Antiquities of the Jews in his so-called Testimonium Flavianum, which he'd written before he wrote his life. Everybody accuses us of coming up with this or tampering with it, but if you just assume that he believed Jesus was the Messiah, although he had doubts about his divinity, everything in his biography and in his writings will make perfect sense. Talk about all this in my video on Libra, which is linked below. Long story short, he pulled that testimony from the same source Luke used to write his story about the incident on the road to Emmaus. So if he were a Christian, why didn't he just say it? Well, the New Testament actually tells us high-ranking Jews, elite Jews, high-status Jews like him, and he was the cream of the crop, kept secret if they converted. If I'm right about Josephus, and that secrecy obviously continued more than 20 years after the destruction of the temple, and that is confirmed by the fact that about 20 years after he died, every Jew who confessed Jesus was Lord was expelled from every synagogue. They were completely expelled from the religion. Let's look at the many, many parallels between the life of Josephus and the Gospels, Luke especially. Like with the Testimonium Flavianum, they demonstrate to me that Josephus isn't as much quoting from the Gospels as he's pulling from the same sources that they did. Okay? And a close scholarly reading of his complete works, obviously in the original Greek, will help tease out a lot of these details. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Jewish Christians would be so heavy into biographies and histories at the same time we have a Jewish historian of the caliber of Josephus. This almost choreographed explosion of biography and history is unparalleled among either the pagans or the Jews. And I think it's because the evangelists and Josephus were all Christians. Now, our parallels. Josephus starts with a genealogy. His is not as extensive as Jesus's. He is the descendant of the Hasmonean priest kings who ruled Jerusalem before the Romans took over through his mother. So his status is about the same as my theoretical Eliezer ben Boethus, who I think is Jesus' husband. That's Lazarus' real name. Josephus, and that's paragraph 1. Josephus was a child prodigy like Jesus when it comes to the Bible. This obviously supports my position that a priest was the source of Luke's infancy narrative. It's something Josephus would know about, because this is part of the narrative of the infancy narrative. Here, Josephus specifically compares himself to Jesus. But if you pay attention to the detail, he's favorable to Jesus. Josephus comes from a family of highborn priests and was born and raised in Jerusalem. Jesus is from a lower class family. I wouldn't say impoverished, but maybe lower middle class, working class, in northern Galilee. And as far as the locals were concerned in Jerusalem, especially high-ranking people like Josephus and his family, they were semi-barbarians. And Josephus was about at least a year older than Jesus. Now remember, when you were that age, there's a big explosive growth in boys, and their brains and their bodies, 12, 13, 14 years old. Remember what a kid a year older looked like compared to you at the time. It was a big change. Now, also, Jesus wasn't even 13 years old yet. And by Jewish tradition, it wasn't until you were 13 that you became responsible for following the commandments. You weren't considered a man. Also, it's actually not correct to say that Jesus was a prodigy. It's more correct to say that he was just naturally wise and discerning. While Josephus was more technical smart than even most of the adults in his life, certainly more than anybody his age, but that's not at all uncommon for high IQ children going into a family calling like being a priest or being a lawyer. You're hearing that from your father your whole life, trained about it your whole life. Josephus's gifts assume a brute intellectual force combined with training. Jesus's, the presence of a flexible and robust native intellect. That's a lot broader than simple brute IQ. So once again, Jesus comes out ahead. Paragraph 2. Also paragraph 2, Josephus studied under a man named Banus, who sounds a lot like John the Baptist. In fact, you'll see Josephus probably quotes from John the Baptist, a quote that is recorded, or at least alludes to a quote that comes only in the Gospel of Luke, only Luke. Paragraph 3, he's in a shipwreck voyaging to Rome, just like Paul of Tarsus. 11, a man named Varus slays messengers of Philip so he can retain power at Philip's expense. Kind of like the workers at the vineyard think they can kill the vineyard's owner, the son of the vineyard's owner, and own the field. Paragraph 12, Jesus, son of Cepheus, is from a lower class family, probably something like Jesus's, burns down a palace meant to be destroyed by Josephus and steals the furniture. Very expensive furniture. The palace had pagan idolatrous carvings on it or something, so Josephus had to destroy it. This is in contrast to Jesus of Nazareth. He picks up his sword. We also see that the priests become quite wealthy through tithes. John of Gischala does not render under Caesar the corn that belongs to Caesar, paragraph 13, but instead takes it for itself. He also makes a nice profit on an oil deal using religion as an excuse. Oil as in oil lamps and stuff, not, Texas tea. Josephus, who is now Caesar, has legitimate claims to this. He is the Caesar. He's secular authority in Galilee. Josephus is a peacemaker, paragraph 14, avoids bloodshed without actually disarming troublemakers, sends out 70, like Jesus, to judge, gives them authority. Story that once again only shows up in Luke. In Josephus's case, these men are hostages that he befriended. You're being held hostage, you're kind of the enemy. They liked him so much. They were willing, they could be trusted to go out. Here's a famous quote. It's a fantastic quote, actually, from paragraph 15. I was now about the 30th year of my age, in which time of life it is a hard thing for anyone to escape the calumnies of the envious, which Jesus did not escape, although he restrains himself from fulfilling any unlawful desire, especially where a person is in great authority, Jesus. Yet did I preserve every woman free from injuries, and as to what presents were offered me, I despise them as not standing in need of them, nor indeed would I take those tithes which are due to me as a priest from those that brought them. He behaves like Jesus at the exact same age Jesus was when he started his ministry, which we only find in Luke. Joseph the Peacemaker, Josephus the Peacemaker, proving that he can be trusted with authorities in Jerusalem, paragraph 15. 23, as Caesar, Josephus only demands due loyalty and due diligence. Thus, men from Trachonitis are not required to convert. It's not Caesar's place. Josephus is an excellent commander, something that's nice to know. Paragraph 24. Paragraph 28. This guy's a Christian. Come on. The retinue of the wife of Ptolemy, the king's procurator, pillaged. Josephus declares, it is prohibited by our laws to spoil even our enemies. Okay. This guy, Whiston, has a footnote. How Josephus could say that the Jewish laws forbade them to spoil even their enemies, while yet a little before his time, our Savior had mentioned it as then a current maxim with them, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thy enemy, is worth our inquiry. I take it that Josephus, having been now for many years an Ebionite Christian, that is a Jewish Christian, had learned this interpretation of the law of Moses from Christ, whom he owned for the true Messiah. For it follows in the succeeding verses, which, though he might not read in St. Matthew's Gospel, yet he might have read much the same expression in his own Ebionite or Nazarene Gospel itself. I think he did read Matthew's Gospel. Don't you love the phrasing? This is from the 1700s. Of which improvements made by Josephus after he became a Christian, we have already had several examples in this life, and shall have many more before its conclusion, as well as have them elsewhere in all of his later writings. Okay? Well, there's not much that's later than this. It's one of his last things that he wrote. Again, something render under Caesar. Paragraph 31, Josephus doesn't want to force conversion. That's not a thing of Caesar. The men they want to convert are accused of witchcraft. Paragraph 35, Josephus shows mercy to his enemies and, like Jesus, gives them bad news. There's no way they're going to beat the Romans. Now, when you tell people that things are okay when they're not okay, you're not their friend. That's enabling. And someone who enables you is not your friend either. You got to have some backbone. It means, obviously, there are times you can't talk to people about things, like the kids when they're acting up, but try to, don't pretend like nothing's wrong. Paragraph 38 through 39, they turn against Josephus. No mention of it being because he was a Christian. I think that's because even 20 years after the destruction of the temple, when he's writing this, he still can't be pushing this too hard. He probably got a lot of pushback, probably got in a lot of trouble for confessing Jesus as the Messiah in his Antiquities. Paragraph 41, the Jews of Galilee loved Josephus, just like they love Jesus. You cannot say that the Jews murdered Jesus. The leaders did, certainly, and they're in hell for that. Well, actually, they might have repented. But no, not the Jews in general. Also, paragraph 41, speaking of that, high-status Jews stand with Josephus just as many of them stood with Jesus, although secretly for the latter, maybe even for both. Acts 6:7 specifically mentions priests. Probably Josephus' father, I think. Josephus has a certain person in a dream telling him that he has a long and happy life ahead of him. I get the impression that you're supposed to know who this person is. I bet it's Jesus. Perhaps Josephus is the one who endures to the end. This is all paragraph 43, I think. When I heard of this is an interesting quote, the entreaties of the Galileans, and saw what sorrow the people were in, I was moved with compassion to them and thought it become me to undergo the most manifest hazards for the sake of so great a multitude. It sounds like Jesus. He's exhausted, he's ready to go, but he looks up and he sees that they're sheep without a shepherd, and so he stays. Mark is very clear about that, Mark 6:34. Paragraph 44, they pretend to be honorable and friendly, but they have laid their bait and their knives are ready to go. Just like with Jesus, are we to pay taxes with Caesar or not? We're just curious, just curious. What's your answer, Jesus? The delegation from Jerusalem tries to find witnesses willing to lie about Josephus. They don't really care if it's true or not. They just want what they want people to say things about him. Another interesting quote. I advise them to fight with nobody, nor spoil the country, but to pitch their tents in the plain and be content with the sustenance they brought with them. For I told them that I had a mind to compose the troubles without shedding any blood. This is, I would say, clearly alluding to a quote from John the Baptist that is only in the Gospel of Luke. Wicked piety used to conceal treachery. Oh, they're so good at that. Oh, they're so good at that. Like a gorgeous mausoleum holding putrid corpses. Josephus confirmed in his government mercy to a conquered enemy who was wicked and treacherous. Love thy enemies. Punish as one of his own soldiers who had taken some plunder to use him as an example for all other soldiers who'd done likewise. Paragraph 60 through 64. Many others wrote histories of the Jewish war with the Romans, but Josephus wants to set the record straight. He also writes this to a man named Epaphroditus as if he's carrying on a conversation with him. Both just like in Luke. And Acts, written by Luke. And now I'm going to read the very first word from Josephus's Jewish wars. Words of Jesus in this Aquarius section that we just looked at should come to mind. I'm confident he was telegraphing to his fellow Christians. He was thinking of Jesus when he wrote this, just like he was thinking of Luke's John the Baptist in paragraph 47 with that quote. Where is the war which the Jews made with the Romans hath been the greatest of all those, and not only that have been in our times, but in a manner of those that ever were heard of. Okay? For in those days there will be suffering, such as not been from the beginning of the creation of God, that God created until now, no, and never will be. Both of those wherein cities have fought against cities, or nations against nations. Come on, guys. When you hear, now the first is from Mark 13:19, this is Mark 13:7 through 8. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed, but this must take place. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. This is all cutting things way too close. There's no way this is an accident. Sorry.